Hello, everybody. Zach Cupples, physical therapist here. And folks, you ever tried to rehab someone, but they keep getting in their own way, meaning they continue to do activities that either cause pain or limit their progress in rehab? Well, if so, then this video is going to be super important for you because we're going to talk about an often underutilized concept in rehabilitative efforts, and that is activity modification. Although we want to ensure that our supreme clientele stay physically active, we do not want the cure, movement, to become the poison. And sometimes you have to modify activity levels in order to ensure you're getting the rehab adaptations that you so desire. Because folks, that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about what activity modification is, the 3 ways that I utilize this concept to help expedite my rehab outcomes, and most importantly, how you can help your supreme clientele buy into temporarily, and that's key, temporarily giving up the activities that they may love that are hindering their rehabilitative progress. Let's dive in, shall we? Folks, have you ever seen a high-level power lifter who is also an elite distance runner? Or have you seen that marathoner, doing their marathon thing and all of a sudden they're pulling an 800-pound deadlift? Most certainly not. And there's a reason for this. And the reason is that the adaptations needed to be a very successful power lifter are different than those of an elite distance runner. And although both qualities can be trained together to a certain extent, eventually there's going to have to be a choice made. Do I want to get freaky strong, or do I want to get better at endurance? Because a lot of the adaptations to excel in either of those domains are mutually exclusive. And folks, that is the crux of specialization. And we intuitively know that, well, if I want to get good at something, I probably have to sacrifice other qualities. And there's no shame in that. That's totally okay. That's normal. We expect that. But folks, could we argue that that same mutual exclusivity could apply to some extent in the rehab context? And in some individuals, I think yes. If your goal is to maximize available movement or to be pain-free in a given task, you may have to cease activities, sometimes temporarily, sometimes maybe permanently, depending on what your goals. You might have to cease activities that are counterproductive to some of the rehabilitation adaptations that you're trying to acquire. So with that said, the goal of activity modification is to minimize interfering activities to pursue specific rehabilitative adaptations. Just like you might cut down on your distance running if you want to be a great powerlifter. There is no difference. Now, folks, that doesn't mean that we're going to be training everyone for the rehab Olympics and get everyone breathing on their back until death do they part. No. But if we have someone who's in pain, or they're recovering after some injury, or we're trying to prevent certain things from happening, it may be that we have to periodize our efforts towards focusing mostly, sometimes exclusively, on developing adaptations that we can only acquire in a rehabilitative context. And we may have to stop or minimize activities that could interfere with us achieving that particular adaptation. And with that in mind, there's 3 ways that I utilize activity modification to facilitate the rehabilitative goals. And I think you're going to find this next section useful, folks, because not only am I going to talk about practical times that I've applied this and it worked, but I'm also going to talk about times where I didn't apply some of these modifications and it failed miserably. And I'm not talking generalities, folks. I'm going to be talking specific cases because I think a lot of us in the movement and fitness and rehabilitation realms, we talk about, you learn from your failures, but no one is willing to hang their ass out and say, no, this is how I failed. Well, you know what? Your boy is going to be willing to do it because I want to save you time so you don't make the same failures that I did. The first and most powerful, in my opinion, is eliminating the activity. Picture this. Suppose you're striking your thumb with a hammer, and you continue to strike your thumb with a hammer. You can apply manual therapy to your thumb to try to alleviate some of the pain. You can take an aspirin, folks, not medical advice, to potentially reduce some of the pain. You might even, oh man, I'm limited in thumb flexion. Maybe I need to try some internal rotation through my arm to help increase the movement options in my thumb. Or you could stop hitting your thumb with the freaking hammer. Sometimes that's the easiest fix. Sometimes we have to do that with our supreme clientele with their rehabilitative efforts. And although that kind of weird example might seem like, well, yeah, of course, you'd stop hitting yourself with a hammer. But I think this is actually a concept practically that I struggle with, and I haven't really seriously applied as much as I should until this past year. And while that example seems blatantly obvious, and I think we can agree that we need to stop hitting ourselves in that case, it's a little bit more murky in the rehabilitative context, because I think a lot of us want to ensure that our supreme clientele stay physically active, especially in a day and age where physical activity is so low. We're dealing with a lot of health and weight abnormalities that are becoming problematic. But I think there were a couple cases off the top of my head that I can think of where, because I didn't do that, I ultimately limited their rehabilitation progress. And these were people who didn't suffer serious injuries where you have to do that. These were people where the activities they were choosing were limiting their rehab progress. And in my mind, there's two instances in which eliminating the offending activity can be useful. The first is if it hurts. That one's pretty obvious. But one that's less obvious is if we think the activity in question is limiting some of the rehabilitative gains that we might be trying to go for. Let me first talk about the elimination of activities that are potentially causing pain. I was working with a woman once who was complaining of feeling asymmetrical within her body, and she had a lot of right-sided pain. Major red flags were ruled out. We were struggling to find any exercise that long-term would not aggravate some of the symptoms and feelings of asymmetry. But she had also mentioned to me that she was feeling worse with very little walking. But then she also stated that she was doing the elliptical for 45 minutes to 2 hours per day, which of course she felt terrible and the symptoms were significantly worse. I tried to pry a bit to see if we could get this individual to stop doing the elliptical for this period of time, because if it's increasing your symptoms, well, this is probably not helping us achieve our rehab goals. But she said, well, this is the only way I can be physically active and I love exercise, so I got to do something. And instead of me pushing a little bit more or offering her an alternative, I kind of obliged her. And I made a mistake there. I should have pushed harder. I should have said, hey, look, if you keep doing this, we're not going to hit the rehab goals that you want, and you're not going to get the outcome that you want. That doesn't mean that you have to quit it forever, but right now it's not a good move. And she ended up ceasing working with me. Had I done that case again, I would have been very adamant about minimizing the activities that were problematic. I think that one seems kind of easy of, okay, yeah, if it hurts, you probably shouldn't do it right now. But what about a case where maybe you have someone who doesn't necessarily have pain from an offending activity, but the adaptations that they're acquiring from that activity might be counterproductive to what you're trying to achieve in rehab? Here's a case that I had that I didn't eliminate the activity in question, and we didn't get the results we wanted. This was a pretty active older gentleman who loved being in the gym. And he was, for an older guy, pretty yoked. Like, man, I'd like to look like him next year. He looked really good. But unfortunately, his exercise menu that he was able to choose from was slowly getting smaller and smaller over the years because of pain in a variety of joints, tendon issues, and he had a joint replacement. And the guy could not hinge, could not go overhead. These were off limits. I evaluated him and I noticed homeboy had no rotation anywhere. Probably had 40 total degrees of hip rotation, ER and IR combined. Shoulders were probably 70 degrees of a total arc, which normal we'd want 160 to 180. So there was nothing. I had coached him initially through some rolling exercises, lower tension activities, and some stuff to expand the posterior part of the pelvis. and we picked up a decent amount of motion. And the reason why I think that worked is because if we have an individual who has minimal movement available at rest, there's increased resting tension in the tissues. This is going to limit passive excursion at joints. So I chose an activity that's the exact opposite of that, something where he's creating minimal to no tension. And we were able to get a decent amount of movement change, but it wasn't full. And when you see someone who is this restricted, things where you're increasing muscular tension, weightlifting, certain martial arts, anything where you got to tighten up really hard for longer periods of time, that stuff can be counterproductive. And the reason being is because those activities, their aim is to increase muscular tension at rest. That's one reason why if you lift a lot of weights, you end up getting a pretty hard and firm body, like your boy. Okay, not really. You get what I'm saying, fam. But so I told this guy this, and I said, hey man, I think we need to stop lifting for a period of time so we could increase your available movement, reduce the resting tension. And it wasn't something he was really about. And the guy lived for resistance training, felt like his body composition wasn't where he wanted it to be. And instead of me educating him and pushing a little bit more firmly on what we needed to do, given that his motion loss was significant enough, instead what I tried to do was find alternative activities that he could do where he could still get the resistance training effect, but minimize some of the negative consequences. And I tried to shore up technique where I could, but it didn't work. And in both of these cases, because I didn't minimize the activities that were interfering with our rehab progress, we didn't get the outcomes we wanted. And after this happened, I learned my lesson, and I have been applying eliminating the activities with great success. And I'm going to show you some examples of how I've done this to great success. I have a client that I'm seeing right now who's dealt with some thoracic outlet symptoms. He's an avid rock climber, but climbing was leading to symptoms down his arm, and he was very stiff everywhere. He had multi-directional limitations, especially in the shoulders, like our gentleman previously. And so we kind of had a two-part thing there. One, the activity he wanted to do was causing symptoms, and two, when you're rock climbing, you're creating a lot of tension to pull yourself up the rocks. So we needed to minimize those in order to get an effective outcome. And he was fully on board with that. And so instead of rock climbing, I said hiking and biking and things where you're not creating a lot of attention could be very effective in the short term instead of rock climbing. And after just about a month of not rock climbing, and this guy had been dealing with TOS for 9 months at this point in time, he was able to hang from a bar without any symptoms whatsoever. A lot of the tension that he was having in his pecs and arm is reduced. He's not getting the crazy pump that he was getting before. Now, the exercises I had given him most certainly had helped. We had gotten some nice movement changes, but we also limited activities that were going to be counterproductive to us increasing that available movement. And that proved to be very useful. I had the same thing happen with a gentleman who was dealing with some shoulder pain when he was lifting weights, and he's also another guy who lives for the weight room. But I didn't want to make the same mistake twice or like 3 times, however many times I made it. And so I educated this guy and I said, hey man, look, you're very stiff in your shoulders. It's hurting to lift. Let's just hold for a brief period of time, and I really want you to focus on trying to drive these qualities. And this was only a 3-week time period that I had him do this. Again, gave him exercises where we focused on minimizing muscular tension. And guess what? After those 3 weeks, he had significant increases in available shoulder range of motion, and we were able to introduce weight room exercises without pain, which 3 weeks ago he couldn't. And he had been dealing with this for a couple months at this point in time. Do not underestimate the power of temporary activity cessation. But folks, you can't stop being physically active forever. No, we have to eventually reintroduce some of the activities that could have been potentially problematic. And that's where this next concept comes into play, and that's slowing the reload, aka slow cooking the brisket so the meat turns out well. Reloading involves reintroducing higher force or velocity activities to help bridge the gap between the low intensity exercises that we might have started with to the client's ultimate goal, which is likely higher force or higher tension activities. When reintroducing the reload, you got to be slow, you got to be controlled, and you got to take your time, because when you are reintroducing intensity, there is the risk for inducing soreness, flare-ups, or exacerbating any types of symptoms. And if you go too fast, you might end up losing the client in the process, because they're going to get discouraged. They're going to think they're back to square one. And the issues I've had with this concept in the past have either been not touching the reloading phase at all or progressing people too quickly. Let's first talk about the times where I didn't touch the reload. I had a couple of folks who were complaining of leg pain in different areas that was aggravated by the field sports that they played. In both cases, I didn't get to the point where we were working on activities that helped bridge the gap. So I didn't get to the chance to where I was trying to introduce plyos, things like that. They continued to play their sports. And then they got frustrated because, well, Zach, I'm not noticing any changes when I'm playing my sports. In this case, I should have had them stop the activity that was hurting, the sports. That was my first mistake. But the other issue that I made was I didn't get to the point, or at least educate them on, hey, we eventually have to reload you into the sports that you're playing, and that's by using higher velocity, higher force activities like plyometrics, sprint work, etc., etc. And because I didn't do these two things, both of these clients had stopped seeing me because of a lack of progress. But really, it wasn't that it was a lack of progress, it was just that we didn't get to the point where we were bridging the gap to the activities that they wanted to do. And it was my fault, because I didn't educate them as well as I could have on the process of what it takes to be able to return to the higher level activities without pain. And this was especially true in one of the cases, because I had eventually got him to the point where I was like, hey, we got to start doing some higher intensity stuff. But he had told me, Zach, well, I've been lifting weights and doing all that. I don't see what's going on there. Well, I'm like, well, show me what you're doing. And I saw his technique, and I'm like, ooh, it's not so great. The jumps were not good. A lot of the plyos weren't looking great. I was getting pain with low speed activities. And in that situation, we really needed a rehaul of the training program. And I think that would have also helped as well. So part of the reload involves controlling as many of those training variables as you can to ensure that everything is helping you push towards the goal in question. And it's within the skill set and realm of ability to perform well that the client can do. Now, conversely, I recently had a client who was dealing with calf pain that was aggravated with hiking. We were able to take care of most of the pain within a couple sessions, but his main issue at this point in time was his calf in question feeling weaker than the other side. And so here I educated this client on the need to reload back up to higher force activities. And I had given him both a lower extremity strengthening exercise and a plyometric progression that he needed to do in order to be successful. And so far, it's working really well. And so with that, you have to make sure that you utilize effective reloading strategies when returning to the activities in question. Because not only is it going to prep you for the forces that you're likely going to deal with in your goal task, but it might also help minimize recurrence and injury, because you're reconditioning the tissues to be able to tolerate those high force, high velocity, high duration activities. Equally important is proper pacing of the reloading period. You cannot expedite the physiological processes that happen during this time, unless you do exogenous stuff, which I can't recommend that, and a lot of it's illegal, so don't do it. But you got to figure, folks, if you've taken time off from activities that are hurting, the tissues needed to perform those activities become deconditioned. So you have to reintroduce those activities slowly, both to recondition the tissues and, folks, to minimize flare-ups of symptoms. And generally, folks, you probably want to go slower than you think. Trust me on this, because it's the times that I went too fast that I got burned. I had a client who was a runner who was dealing with knee pain, and he had a race that he wanted to run in 6 weeks. So there was a bit of a time crunch, and I probably pressured myself a bit to appease him and see if I could get him there quickly. The first session went really well. We did some activities that increased motion, and he felt really, really good. But I felt the pressure. I felt the time crunch. It's like, man, we only got 6 weeks, and he really wants to run this. So on the next session, I didn't have as much motion as I had wanted, but I thought, you know what? Maybe I can get the motion that I need with some standing isometric exercises. It's going to minimize the loading through the leg, and my hope is we can kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Boy, was I wrong. And I only had given him squats and split squats, but I saw that he canceled his next appointment, and I'm like, that's weird. So I reached out, asked him what was up, and he stated that he felt his knee pain was worse after the last session, which he didn't report any symptoms during, so probably had a latent flare-up afterwards, and he didn't want to take the chance of re-aggravating it, and he had canceled the race and stopped seeing me. And there, folks, I made the mistake of rushing the client back too quickly, and it burned me. He didn't get the outcome that he wanted. I didn't get the chance to educate him as much as I could have on the need or on what happens when you flare up. But what I really should have done was forget about the timeline that we had and trust my tests, trust my outcome measures and my objective assessment to let me know when he was versus wasn't ready for the activities in question. But by golly bows, I vowed to never make that mistake again. This time I had a different runner who was dealing with hip and leg pain for quite some time. We're talking like a couple of years now, and she had to miss an entire year of cross country and track because of it. So the first thing I did was have her lay off running, like, we can't do this because it's aggravating you, so eliminating activity. And eventually I had gotten her to the point where we were able to begin the reloading process. And man, did I take my time. I mean, she had missed a year, so she wasn't in a big time crunch. I mean, heck, she would have been happy just to get back to running. So I made sure that we did low-level activities to restore motion, and then I chose appropriate plyometric progressions to make sure symptoms were minimized with the reload. So that included doing slow speed resistance exercise first, nothing. There, it was lower level plyometrics, nothing. Then strides, then higher intensity plyos. Everything was symptom free. And it was when I got through that progression that I felt comfortable introducing some running. And so we had her start with some run walks, coupled with some longer runs from time to time. And although she had some symptoms here and there, she was overall able to increase her mileage to a significant degree, return to track that year, and hit several PRs in her events. It was pretty dang cool. Folks, you cannot rush the recovery process, no matter how hard you try. You have to take what the client gives you, use objective measures to determine when you should or shouldn't introduce something. And if you do that and you take your time, the chances of you mitigating any setbacks and flare-ups is very high, and you're likely going to get them to the outcome even faster because you never have to take those steps back. Now, folks, minimizing activity and reloading intelligently are useful, but how do we maintain conditioning levels during? How do we mitigate or minimize future injury risk and increase movement options, not just through the rehab process, but beyond that? That's where activity accommodation comes into play. Basically, activity accommodation involves choosing supportive activities that will encourage increasing movement options, and it will also simultaneously increase the desired physiological adaptations needed for whatever that person wants to do, while minimizing injury risk or losing desired movement options. In simple terms, it basically means designing a training program that is geared towards that specific individual, one that fits the lifestyle and the goals of your supreme clientele. This tactic is especially useful when you can't eliminate a lot of offending activities or you don't have a reloading strategy that you can implement. For example, like right now, I have a bodybuilder client who's dealt with long-standing neck pain. He works 12 hours a day in front of a computer, and this is something that we cannot modify. He has to do this because that's his livelihood at stake. But he also mentioned that his neck felt worse after his training, and so we couldn't modify the 12-hour work days. But I might be able to get some real estate by changing his training program to where it complements what we're doing on the rehab side. And so I ended up observing one of his training sessions, and bruh is strong as all hell, but he was creating a lot of tension and really putting his neck in an undesirable position while he was training. So it makes sense why it would hurt. And so initially what I did was I coached the snot out of his exercises without giving him any modifications, gave him a few things to focus on, and now he actually reports feeling better after lifting weights. And that's just modifying what he's doing. I think that if we actually flip the program to variations that will also help enhance movement options, then we're really going to be winning. And folks, if I didn't modify his training at all, and he didn't buy into that, the chances of us of getting a successful rehabilitative outcome are going to be significantly reduced. In these cases, the lower level rehab exercises, manual therapies, and the other things that we do, which again work, become Band-Aids eventually, and they're not an effective long-term solution. What is effective is tailoring the training program to the individual's needs so we can maximize movement and drive the physiological qualities that we want. And I've seen this time and time again with a lot of my own training clients. The bulk of my Supreme clientele are beat up fit pros who, lifting big old weights, they get beat up, they come to your boy Big Z and it's like, hey man, I still want to train. What can we do? What we do is we accommodate. I assess them and I design a program that's specific to their individual needs. And oftentimes we can get a lot of these folks back to training at very high intensities and high levels without a lot of pain or discomfort. If it's something you're interested in, I'll put a link in the description below to go ahead and sign up for it because I still got a couple slots and I'll try to fit you in. But I would argue that modifying and addressing this area is a piece that a lot of us are missing in the rehab field. We do so much to help people get out of pain, but what do we do to encourage them staying pain-free? That's where giving them an individualized training program, I think, can be quite effective at facilitating that long-term progress. Okay, Zach, this all sounds well and good, but some of this is going to be kind of hard sells for my Supreme clientele. I mean, you think that my client is going to want to give up weightlifting for any period of time? Or I work with runners, and you know how runners are. They just want to find every single way to keep their conditioning up. What do I do to get them to buy into this stuff? Well, I'm glad you asked. What I've found to be most effective is plotting a course for them, showing them the roadmap of where they're at now to where they want to be, telling them their rehabilitative story. In fact, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll draw out the steps for my clients so they can gauge where they are at in the rehab program. And it might look something like this. Here you can see that I talk about a lot of the rehab qualities that we're trying to get, and it's done in a step-by-step fashion. And it shows the individual that you need to be able to do this, and then you need to be able to do that, and then you do that, and then if we can do that, then we can get to the terminal task. And while we can't always predict how long this is going to take, a lot of times just showing the individual the rehab pathway that they're on can be very calming, and it can help put them in a frame of mind that they know that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. I think that if I had done this with some of the individuals who I had failed with, I would have likely had a better outcome. And in fact, recently, I almost had this failure because I only verbalized a story and I didn't draw it out. You remember that client who I talked about who's dealing with shoulder pain, who loves lifting, and I told him to stop? Yeah, he almost quit on me. So I had initially given him some low tension activities and told him to stop lifting. And we had gotten some nice improvements in range of motion, and he felt pretty good after the first session. But then he came to me the next appointment a couple weeks later, and he started with this line. I almost fired you because I'm not feeling any better. Thank God I got a second go. After validating his concerns, I plotted out the steps of what he needed to get back to where he wanted to be. And because I had some markers in mind, shoulder range of motion, it was good enough that we were able to reintroduce weights on that day. And he was able to do these lifts pain-free. Not only that, but he felt very confident in the process after I outlined all the steps that he had to go through. Had I preemptively drawn out this person's rehab course and told him, hey, at this point in time when you can do this, then we can get back to weights, he likely would have had a little bit more trust in the process, and we wouldn't have had the conversation that we had. Unfortunately, I was able to teach him this on the second visit, and he's back to lifting weights, pain-free, is able to surf, do a lot of things they wanted to do without any issues. And there you have it, folks. Those are really the keys needed when it comes to modifying someone's physical activity so it enhances your rehabilitative outcomes. It's important because you want to minimize any activities that will interfere with pursuing your rehab goals. Either eliminate the activity, reload slowly back into those activities, and accommodate the training program so you give your supreme clientele sustained rehabilitative outcomes. What struggles have you had introducing activity modification with your supreme clientele? Are there strategies or tactics that you use that I didn't talk about that you found useful? Why don't you go ahead and comment below and let the fam know. And while you're here, if you've liked content like this, you want more of it, go ahead and hit the like and subscribe button. It helps teach the almighty YouTube algorithm about the wonders that Big Z has to offer you fine, wonderful, outstanding people. Otherwise, thank you so much for tuning in. You've been an incredible, outstanding audience, and I hope that you keep it real, but not to the extent where things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, stay moving, and I'll see you next time. Deuces.